With a Metacritic score of 95, The Last of Us Remastered is the third highest rated PS4 game of all time, and rightly so. The Last of Us wasn't just a great game, it elevated the entire medium of video games. Now, its sequel is set to release on May 29th, and while it's the storytelling that may have set the original game apart, the gameplay was also second to none. And when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2, that's exactly what I focus on. From the new movement mechanics and more open environments to the new enemies and updated AI systems, it's all here in one gigantic preview. After examining dozens of articles, videos, and reports, I truly believe Naughty Dog have outdone themselves once again. So if you're as excited as I am, I hope you'll sit back, maybe subscribe to the channel, and join me as I look at everything we know about the gameplay of The Last of Us Part 2. This Quest Mode video was brought to you by Quest Mode. Visit my brand new merch store to pick up a shirt, sticker, or other goodie, and you'll help a fellow gamer follow his dream of making content just like this for people just like you. You'll find the link directly below this video, but for now, let's get into it. As a sequel to one of the best games of all time, it's no surprise that The Last of Us Part 2 is keeping intact most of the mechanics from the first game. But Naughty Dog isn't a studio to rest on their laurels, and they've included some new core mechanics that look to create a more flexible and fluid experience that the developers call survival action. First, and perhaps most exciting, is the addition of a jump button. In the first game, Joel wasn't able to jump, but Ellie, being an athletic 19-year-old, is a much more agile protagonist. Not only will jumping make it easier to grab a hold of ledges and leap across chasms, but Anthony Newman, co-director on The Last of Us Part 2, has said that adding a jump mechanic enabled his team to create far more interesting puzzles. Given that the first game relied perhaps too heavily on the swimming and ladder puzzles, this is a major plus. The next most significant addition to Ellie's set of maneuvers is her ability to go prone. You'll now be able to crawl through tall grass and hide under cars, but don't think that you're entirely hidden just because you're kissing the dirt. As I'll talk about later, being low to the ground does make you more stealthy, but it doesn't guarantee that you won't be spotted. Thankfully, you can still fire your weapons when prone, and doing so looks surprisingly intuitive. The next new ability, and the one that I'm guessing will get used the most, is the dodge maneuver. When an enemy takes a swing, you can avoid impact with a quick press of the dedicated dodge button. And while you obviously can't dodge bullets, dodging while an enemy is shooting at you will reduce their accuracy. And, interestingly enough, the dodge maneuver is also a big reason why the combat in The Last of Us Part 2 looks so seamless. That's because Ellie's evasive maneuvers change depending on the direction from which your enemy attacks and the angle at which they swing their weapon. This is just part of Naughty Dog's new animation system that makes combat encounters look almost like fully scripted cutscenes. Ellie is also smaller in stature than Joel, and this gives her an advantage when she encounters what the developers are calling, quote, squeeze-throughs, narrow passages that you can quickly pass through as you evade or flank enemies. It also works well in combination with another new mechanic, trap mines. Trap mines are homemade bombs that you can craft on the fly that explode when an enemy comes into close proximity. In terms of exploration, one smaller but extremely welcome addition is the ability to break windows using bricks or melee attacks. In the first game, this simply wasn't possible, but now if you find a locked door and there's a window that connects to the same room, you no longer have to pick the lock or find another way in. Also helping with exploration is that Ellie now apparently has a rope that she can use to climb up walls and other vertical surfaces. Unfortunately, we haven't seen this in any released footage, but as described by several news outlets, it sounds like it might behave somewhat like Nathan Drake's grappling hook in Uncharted 4, but probably without all the over-the-top acrobatics. Finally, one mechanic from the original game that I'm surprised nobody has mentioned in any official Last of Us coverage, at least not that I've heard or read, is swimming. Ellie famously couldn't swim in Part 1, which set up puzzles where Joel had to find ways to help her cross deep bodies of water. Based on a comment from Newman, again the game's co-director, it seems reasonable that Ellie will finally be able to swim for herself. Quote, "So for Part 2, it's 5 years after the first game, and Ellie has been forced to survive in this world for 5 years. You know she's picked up a lot of lessons from Joel, but she's had to learn a lot of stuff on her own." End quote. Based on that quote, I'd be shocked if Joel just forgot to teach Ellie such a basic survival skill. So those are the most significant new mechanics in The Last of Us Part 2. There are a few more minor mechanics, but they're each tied closely to either combat, stealth, crafting, or skill upgrades, and I take a deep look at each of those systems later in this video. But first, I want to take a step back and look at the world you'll be exploring and how it's shaping up to be the most ambitious and immersive Naughty Dog has ever created. If Naughty Dog holds to the standard we've come to expect, the environments in The Last of Us Part 2 should be among the richest and most detailed ever seen in a video game. So far, we've seen two distinct locations. First is the wintry wilderness of Jackson, Wyoming. It's here, near the beginning of the game, that Ellie and her romantic interest, Dina, patrol the dangerous outskirts of the Stronghold community they now call home. The second gameplay segment that Naughty Dog has showcased takes place sometime later amidst the crumbling ruins and overgrown suburbs of Seattle. Like in the first game, it appears the different story segments will take place during different seasons, and as such, expect some jaw-dropping environmental effects. You'll see snow drift off tree branches as you pass beneath, and individual blades of grass sway and quiver as you crawl past enemies. Of course, great visuals are table stakes for Naughty Dog. The real question is just how big and how open will these areas be? In an interview with IGN, Neil Druckmann, game director on The Last of Us Part 2, indicated that they'll definitely be more open than in Part 1. Quote, "You've seen in the last couple games, Uncharted 4 and The Lost Legacy, how we've played around with much larger spaces than in previous games, and we're continuing that philosophy here." End quote. But Druckmann made it clear that The Last of Us remains a linear experience, as making it a true open world would dampen the urgency of such a suspenseful story. He explained this through the lens of a rescue mission. I'm paraphrasing, but he made the point that if you need to save someone who's in immediate danger, having the option to first go on 10 different side quests doesn't reflect or respect that level of tension. To tackle this challenge, Druckmann said his team created a world that's open when tension is low and narrow when things kick into high gear. Quote, "Depending on where we are within the story, we might open things up significantly and say, okay, here are some optional things you can go explore, some side stories, or you can go directly next to where you're meant to go. But the tension is not high. And as the tension ratchets up, we might tighten things up. You might play a very scripted, authored Naughty Dog set piece." End quote. So with all that said, the question remains, will we see areas as open as, say, Chapter 4 in Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, where you could explore an open world style map in any order you chose? It sounds likely, but we ultimately don't know. What we do know is that levels will be non-linear, at least in terms of the many paths you can take from point A to point B. For example, here we see Ellie take on some bad guys in an abandoned store, which Newman said you might not even see depending on your playthrough. Quote, "This is just one possible playthrough this space," he said. "The player didn't have to go this way. They could have gone this completely other way." End quote. He also said that no matter where you go, enemies are programmed to hunt you down. So this encounter likely wouldn't have happened had Ellie not been spotted earlier. In other words, expect things to play out much differently on each playthrough or even after each time you die. And linearity or lack thereof might apply to more than just environments. During a panel at E3 2018, Druckmann referred back to The Last of Us DLC, Left Behind, when he cryptically hinted that we'll explore not just multiple areas, but also multiple timelines. Quote, "The other thing we've done in Left Behind is we had two timelines that we were playing with and kind of jumping back and forth. And that's something that is an interesting way to tell a story, and at least in this demo, you're seeing two times where the story takes place, and maybe that expands further." End quote. Of course, Druckmann was referring to the E3 2018 gameplay reveal that juxtaposed a warm and emotional dance scene with a brutal combat sequence that takes place sometime later. So, with multiple paths and multiple timelines, and given that Naughty Dog has confirmed they've never made a game as long as The Last of Us Part 2, just how long will it be? Well, those who played the most recent gameplay demo reported spending anywhere between 2 and 4 hours. Putting that into perspective, Druckmann said the demo makes up a, quote, tiny fraction of this entire game. Given that The Last of Us Remastered took me around 16 hours, I'm guessing Part 2 will take at least 20. To keep things from getting too lonely along the way, we know that for much of your adventure, you'll have an ally by your side. In Wyoming, you'll be roaming the countryside with Dina, and in Seattle, it's a safe bet that you'll team up once again with Joel. Given how much he's aged over the past 5 years, one has to wonder how well can he keep up with Ellie. It would seem poetic if this time we saw her helping him, not the other way around. Also, in the very first reveal trailer for The Last of Us Part 2, we saw 3 other characters who could potentially become your allies. First are Yara and Lev, 2 sisters who are clearly capable of defending themselves, and third is this woman who we know virtually nothing about. Whoever travels by your side, Naughty Dog have confirmed that they'll have improved AI. One of the few blemishes on The Last of Us Part 1 was that your ally would frequently wander into an opponent's line of sight, who then behaved as if they hadn't seen anything. The developers have acknowledged that this is difficult to avoid altogether, but they've confirmed that efforts have been made to ensure it happens less frequently. And perhaps more exciting is that AI companions will also be more efficient in combat. Like in the first game, they'll offer a health kit at times, but they'll also be capable of performing their own stealth kills, and their ammo will deal the same amount of damage as yours. That's in stark contrast to, say, Uncharted, where good guys not named Nathan Drake dealt far less damage. Given the more open areas, the new movement mechanics, the smarter companions, and even how environments can help build tension, I'm optimistic that exploring this post-outbreak world will make for some of the most invigorating exploration and engrossing story progression we've ever seen from Naughty Dog. That said, I have yet to examine the part of the game that looks, at least to me, the most impressive of all. If you thought the fighting was brutal in The Last of Us Part 1, you ain't seen nothing yet. We'll get into how Naughty Dog is making things more realistic, brutal, and tense, but first I want to cover the specific combat mechanics that I haven't already mentioned. I did touch on the new craftable weapons, like trap mines, but you can also now craft stun bombs, which sound like smoke bombs that also stun your enemies with a concussive blast. And most exciting, at least to me, are explosive arrows, which can apparently explode enemies in just one shot. We haven't seen any other new ammo types, but I can't imagine that Naughty Dog stopped at just one. Another combat-related item that you can craft are silencers. While you can upgrade the durability of silencers later in the game, they'll initially only last 3 shots, so you'll want to use them sparingly. Nonetheless, it's awesome to have another ranged stealth option aside from arrows. And speaking of arrows, unlike The Last of Us Part 1, enemies now have their own bows and arrows. At face value, this might not change the combat all that much, but there's a catch. Whenever you're shot with an arrow, it stays lodged in the wound until you press R1 to remove it. Until you do, Ellie won't be able to use listen mode, and her aim will be impaired. I personally think this ramps up the realism. After all, arrows don't pull themselves out. Nor do they pick themselves up, and to that point, I want to highlight this bit of incredible animation. Look how smoothly the arrows fall out of your enemy's quiver right before Ellie picks them up. This is obviously at least 2 separate animations, but you'd never know just by watching. Another detail you might have missed because it looks so seamless takes place right here. Apparently, Ellie can now put enemies in a chokehold and use them as human shields. The fact that practically nobody is mentioning this makes me wonder what other mechanics Naughty Dog might have snuck into their gameplay demo that nobody noticed. One major improvement to The Last of Us Part 2 that won't go under the radar, even though it happens mostly behind the scenes, is the new and improved artificial intelligence. I already mentioned how your companion's AI has improved, but your enemies are smarter as well. The first and most notable change is that they now know each other by name. So if you kill someone's friend, or worse, their spouse, they'll shriek out their name in anguish. The idea is to make every person in this world feel human, or as Druckmann said, they wanted you to, quote, feel a little dirty when you're killing them, end quote. But there's more to it than that. According to a post on the PlayStation blog, when an enemy recognizes that you've killed their friend, their actions will become more erratic as their anger swells. And the wizards at Naughty Dog have made a ton of other AI improvements. For starters, whereas bad guys in Part 1 had pretty limited search parameters, they're now much more capable of snuffing you out. Say you're taking refuge under a car. Well, if an enemy's on your trail, they will find you. And if an enemy sees you running into a building, they'll call their comrades to flank you or toss in a smoke bomb to pressure you out.
Smoker out!
If you have managed to stay hidden, the game uses a new system called analog stealth, which I alluded to earlier. Now, the degree to which you're hidden changes based on several factors. How low are you to the ground? How tall is the grass around you? And how close are your aggressors? The kicker is that even if you're prone, you're never entirely concealed unless you're behind a wall or some other physical obstruction. So enemies that are just a few feet away or perched atop a lookout will sense something if they see, for example, your backpack protruding from some tall grass. Another layer of realism is another new system called Vague Knowledge, which gives bad guys new ways to hone in on your general location. For example, if you kill an enemy with an arrow, other enemies can deduce where you might be based on the direction the arrow was fired. Another improvement is how enemies communicate. While your foes did communicate in Part 1, it was mostly instantaneous. Now, when an enemy discovers, say, a body, the knowledge of that information will, quote, ripple out at a more realistic and gradual pace as enemies share the news across the entire level. Lastly, one final wrinkle to the AI is that when enemies do finally track you down or you attack them outright, they can react far more dynamically. For example, they can now block your melee swings if they're wielding a sizable weapon such as a hatchet. Overall, you could argue that none of these improvements to the AI, combat, and stealth are outright game changers, but when it all works together and you see it in motion, it's hard to deny that the combat in The Last of Us Part 2 could be nothing short of groundbreaking. And we've actually only seen the half of it. What about the enemies themselves? Well, there are humans, there are infected, and for the first time, there's one type of enemy that's actually neither. Let's take a look. While the infected enemies in the Last of Us universe might be the most terrifying, it's the smarter, more capable human enemies that are the most dangerous. So far, we know of several factions you'll encounter in The Last of Us Part 2. First are the WLF, or Washington Liberation Front, also known as the Wolves. The WLF is an organized militia that plain old just don't like visitors. If they see anybody on their turf that's not one of them, they'll shoot to kill. What makes them particularly interesting is the entirely new type of enemy they bring to the battlefield, and they're neither human nor infected. I'm referring, of course, to attack dogs, which add probably the biggest wrinkle to both stealth and combat in The Last of Us Part 2. Just like in real life, dogs in The Last of Us have a keen sense of smell, and if they cross your scent, they'll follow you until you either create some distance or distract them by throwing a brick or a bottle. If they do track you down, they'll attack you and give away your location. Thankfully, you can level the playing field by entering Listen mode. This reveals the trail left by your scent, which happens to be the same path the dogs will take as they track you down. Ultimately, dogs eliminate the relative safety you might have gained in The Last of Us Part 1 by camping. Even if nearby humans are unaware of your presence, the minute a dog picks up your scent, you'll have to get a move on. Dogs also make it trickier to execute stealth attacks because they often stay close to their master and, well, you can't sneak up on both at the same time. Whether you pick off the dog or the human first, you'll then have to dispatch the other, and quickly. And if you do get into a literal dogfight, the experience of putting one down is just as inhumane as it sounds. Not only do they yelp in pain, but so do their owners. Just as enemies know each other by name, they also have names for their dogs, which they'll scream out in anguish should they bear witness. Brutal? Yes, but you can't deny that it's realistic. That said, if this makes you uncomfortable, Naughty Dog has said that at least in the demo, you don't have to kill a single pup. In fact, if you like to keep a low profile and you're a skilled stealth player, Naughty Dog says you'll be able to ghost through many areas of the game without getting noticed. However, there will be areas that will force you into conflict, so don't expect to clear the entire game without getting your hands bloody. So that's the WLF. The other faction we've seen are the Seraphites, a group of religious fanatics who also appear in and around Seattle. Based on this clip, which even I have trouble watching, the Seraphites seem to embrace violence in ways that go far beyond what's necessary to survive. It's not clear whether they will also have dogs, but there is something else that makes them unique. When the Seraphites are hunting you down, they use a whistling dialect to coordinate their attacks. That means you'll have no idea whether they're telling each other to close in on your location, to flank you, or to retreat. Granted, using listen mode will still help, but not being able to understand their comms should make things more challenging. According to a YouTube video posted by Giant Bomb, there is a third faction, Fedra, which makes a return from The Last of Us Part 1. If you don't remember, Fedra are a remnant of the US military, but they're not as friendly as you might hope. Lastly, we haven't heard much about the Fireflies, but whether they're a major part of the story or not, it sounds like the world's human population has evolved into a spiderweb of different groups, each with their own goals and survival methods. But of course, what makes The Last of Us, well, The Last of Us, aren't the people. It's the poor souls that have fallen victim to the cordyceps infection. Both runners and clickers are making their return. Runners, if you need a refresher, have only recently been infected, so while they have lost their mind, they still have their speed and their vision. Clickers, on the other hand, have been infected for much longer and hence have less control over their body and are tougher to take down. They're also blind and use echolocation to stalk their prey. If they click in your general direction, you'll want to stay absolutely still. The third type of infected making a return are stalkers, which we only saw a few times in The Last of Us and Left Behind. Stalkers look similar to clickers, but are actually a class of enemy in between runners and clickers. What sets them apart is their penchant for hiding and launching ambush attacks. That's not to mention that they might run away if you've got the upper hand. Of course, if you can launch your own surprise attacks, no matter who or what you're up against, you'll be in much better shape. In fact, it looks like you'll be performing many more stealth attacks in The Last of Us Part 2 than in Part 1. That's because gone are the fragile shivs that you had to use in order to stealth kill infected enemies. Now, just like in Left Behind, Ellie has a switchblade, perfect for surprise attacks, and unlike shivs, it never deteriorates. In other words, you can pick off as many infected enemies as you want without worrying about your inventory. I find this a refreshing change, but it does leave me wondering whether taking out, say, a group of clickers might be a little too easy. The last type of infected enemy from the original game, bloaters, haven't been mentioned in any coverage that I've seen, but there is a new type that's rather similar. They're called shamblers, and like bloaters, they're covered in an armor-like plating that they then use to their advantage. You see, shamblers will creep towards you even in the face of gunfire, and when they get close, or if you kill one, they'll emit a harmful cloud of spores. They're also impervious to stealth kills, so your best bet is to run away or use high damage weapons like explosive arrows, trap mines, and Molotovs. One final note on combat. Thanks to the power of the PS4, The Last of Us Part 2 will frequently feature more enemies on screen than we ever saw in Part 1 or Left Behind. You'll sometimes encounter multiple squads of human enemies at once, or even a quote, horde of infected enemies. And don't be ashamed to run away if things get too hectic. The developers have said that running away is not only a viable option, it's often your only option. Whether you keep a distance or you stay and fight, let's now look at how you'll be able to craft the right items for the job and spec out your character to suit your playstyle. Mechanically speaking, crafting works similarly, if not identically, to The Last of Us Part 1. You scavenge for parts which you spend on the items you want to craft. And crafting still takes place in real time, but those are just the mechanics. The system by which you earn the ability to craft certain items is entirely new. If you remember from Part 1, new crafting abilities were unlocked automatically as you reached certain parts in the story. Now, new abilities, including the abilities to craft new items, are unlocked via a set of skill trees. That's in stark contrast to the original game, which featured only 6 skills that were actually more like attributes, and which were all available from the start of the game. In Part 2, if you want to access Ellie's more advanced skills, you'll have to pour your resources into one of several skill trees, which Naughty Dog are calling upgrade branches. We know there will be at least 4 upgrade branches, 2 of which we've actually seen. First is the Precision branch, which lets you upgrade your movement speed while aiming and the ability to hold your breath to steady your sights, among others. Next is the Stealth branch, which lets you increase the clarity of listen mode, boost your movement speed while prone, and craft silencers. In a post on the PlayStation blog, Sony also revealed 2 other ability branches. The Survival branch lets you upgrade your health, your throw distance, and the range of listen mode, while the Crafting branch lets you craft melee upgrades and stun bombs, as well as boost your crafting speed and even craft 2 items for the price of 1. And what makes the character upgrade system even more interesting is that, similar to training manuals which boosted your skills in The Last of Us Part 1, you can now find survival guides. But here, guides don't just boost individual skills. They actually unlock entire ability branches. Seen here, Ellie discovers a survival guide that gives her access to the Precision ability branch. This makes me wonder, will you be able to go through the entire game without discovering certain skill sets? That would be interesting. Naughty Dog have also changed the weapon upgrade screen, albeit in a more superficial way. Rather than just feature a simple menu where you select upgrades and add-ons, the camera now zooms in as Ellie makes her adjustments. From what we've seen, each weapon will feature its own set of attributes that you can upgrade. For example, with the pistol, you can upgrade its rate of fire, recoil, ammo capacity, and stability, while the rifle features rate of fire and capacity upgrades, but it also lets you upgrade damage stats and boost the magnification of your scope. The very last thing I want to mention about The Last of Us Part 2 is that, for better or worse, the game will not feature a multiplayer mode. However, Naughty Dog has said they're working on what sounds like a standalone multiplayer experience that takes place in the Last of Us universe, and it's inspired by the Factions mode in Part 1. My guess is this will be released for the PS5 sometime after 2020, but that's pure speculation on my part. And with that, I think I've covered just about everything we know about what is undoubtedly one of the most anticipated games of the year. If I missed anything, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. And if you really liked this video, like really liked it, click the link in the description to head over to my merch store where you can pick up a shirt, mug, or other goodie to support my quest to create more content just like this. Or if you'd like to support me but without the whole spending money thing, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And finally, thank you so much for watching. If you never want to miss any of my content, all it takes is clicking that subscribe button. Until next time, I want to remind everyone to never stop questing.